thing start. Okay. Welcome to the Beef on Dairy Dialogue webinar series, an extension of the annual Dairy Beef Short Course held in conjunction with the Central Plains Dairy Expo each March. The short course is the longest running program focusing on steers with dairy genetics in the U.S., with 15 years of continuous programming. The short course is sponsored by the I-29 MU University, a consortium of extension specialists from Iowa State University, University of Minnesota, University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and South Dakota State University. The 2026 Beef on Dairy Dialogues webinar series continues today with a presentation by Dr. Warren Rusche, who currently serves as an assistant professor and SDSU Extension Beef Feedlot Management Specialist at South Dakota State University. His presentation will discuss the current trends in carcass size. As I always say, Warren, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Fred. Appreciate having the opportunity to share this information. And this has been I've given this a version of this talk several times now this spring, and it seems to be one that's being well received, and hopefully it answers some of the questions on what's going on in the industry and why are things going on happening the way they are. And I'll try to share a little bit of what our perspective is of some of those reasons why, then talk about what some of the challenges might be going forward as we look at what changes in carcass size that's been occurring. Eh, There. All right. First thing, I wanted to share a little bit, maybe some of the reason why I developed this presentation and this focus on my extension program, and it really started with this article. So this was written by one of our news writers that's on the team at SDSU that helps us get the word out of what we're doing on the extension research side. And and the article she wrote, that's the screenshot of the headline. It talked about SDSU extension helping cattle producers grow bigger, better beef. I'm not sure that's the title I would have chose, to be honest, but frankly, we certainly are trying to make cattle better, and we weigh them. That's a picture of our crew weighing off some cattle that were ending a study, and so I came away thinking, well, although it might not have been what I picked, I think I have to own that title because that is really what we're doing. And I got an email from an individual. I'm not quite sure where this person was from. I think he might have been a beef producer from Iowa, but I'm not sure. And the response was, "Well, how big is big enough? What size cuts do consumers want?" And in this person's view, we needed to focus more on efficiency. That at least from a beef production standpoint, his opinion, we could make more money raising medium-sized efficient calves. And so that led me to the conclusion, and we emailed back and forth, and it became pretty clear he really wasn't interested in the discussion. He just wanted to tell me I was wrong, which didn't bother me that much. I told people I've worked for family for a dozen years, and I've worked in extension for almost 20. I've been told I'm wrong a lot. I've been told I'm wrong with enthusiasm, even. So that didn't bother me. But what it did point out is there may be some opportunity to not convince anyone that I'm right, but to share some information to explain there are some real reasons why we are making cattle bigger. And so that's my purpose of what I'm going to talk about today, with a bit of a particular focus on the dairy derived cattle, how that fits with some of those, and what are some of these implications of this trend of larger carcass size. So, first off, and just as this is photographic proof, we've done some research work with these beef on dairy cattle. This is a group we were getting ready to ship those out in January of 2025, and we'll share a little of the data on that study as I go forward in this presentation. So the first thing I wanted to show is just a change in carcass weights over time. This comes out of the USDA, goes back to the early 1960s. I think in this particular data set, it probably ends at about 2023. Trust me, that trend has not changed. If anything, it's accelerated just in the last few years. But you can see over the last 60 years, we've added on average about 4.5 pounds of carcass weight per year. With some little blips here and there. If you wanted to go back through history, you could pick out those time points where maybe we had higher feed costs or poor economic conditions that affected demand for a time that push those things up or down or whatever. But over time, this is maybe as consistent a trend in the beef business as any, is that we have continuously increased the size of the carcasses that we're selling. And and to illustrate, at least as an example of why, I wanted to show, well, although this data set. And while it wasn't beef on dairy, the lessons we learned really apply regardless of genetic type of these cattle. What this was is ended up being a 6-year project from start to finish, where we partnered with the North American Limousine Foundation. That organization really wanted to get an answer on how they ranked compared to other breeds in terms of things like feed efficiency, carcass outputs, feedlot gain, and so forth. And so they worked with us to design a study. What they did is they found 2 commercial herds in western Montana, and they used 9 different AI sires, 3 that were Angus, 3 that were Limousine, and 3 that were Limflex. If that's a term that's not familiar to you, a Limflex is a hybrid or a composite of Limousine and Angus. And so what we were doing is we were creating calves with really varying proportions of Limousine versus Angus genetics. The cow herd in Montana were primarily Angus influenced. I would say they were essentially 100% Angus based. So they AI'd those cows to those bulls, calved out the cows, and then at weaning time, they sent those calves to us here at Brookings, where we put them on a feeding trial in our individual feeding barn, where then we could get individual feed intake. And as part of that, we took those cattle out to 3 different market date endpoints. We What we did is we put them on study in January of 2024 and fed them for either 200, 235, or 270 days. And that gave us an idea of then how we could change composition and weight over time. This is what that looked like in terms of live weight and carcass weight. I've got live weight on the left side of the screen and carcass weight on the right. The blue line were the steers. That orangish line, that was the heifers, is because we did feed steers and heifers together, or, were managed together in this study. You can see that on the steer line, we essentially went from a 1,500 pound outweight on the 200-day cattle up to about 1,750 when we took them out to 15 to 270 days, with correspondingly lighter weights on the heifers. If I look on the carcass weight, we start out at, on a steer basis, roughly 900 pounds to over getting closer to 1,000 pounds, 1065 on the steers, going out to 270. I showed that because I wanted to give all of you an idea of, we took these cattle out to, I would actually argue we didn't really go a great deal beyond what the industry is doing. As I talked to cattle feeders, in fact, this was a quote a friend of mine gave me when I told him we're going to take these steers out to around 1,700. He said, "Well, that's not so terribly big." And in today's feeding world, especially here in the upper Midwest, it's really not. There's a lot of groups of cattle now that go out at 1,750 or so. But what does make this unique is that most other studies that evaluated outweight and days on feed ended about where we started. The best data sets out there went to about 1,500. We kept going for an extra 70 days really to try to capture what happens going with extended days on feed to composition and so forth. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in terms of composition, other than they did what you expect them to do. As we got them heavier, they got fatter. If you think of feed efficiency on a live weight basis, they got less efficient, as you would expect. But what we also did is we put some economics to that. And the bottom line is, now these are using numbers, prices, feed costs, and cattle values from 2024. Clearly different than what we're dealing with today. But as we added cattle, as we put cattle on feed and made them heavier and fatter, we made more money, period. And that, to me, in a nutshell, is what is driving this. Back to that, That gentleman that emailed me that was questioning the wisdom of what we were doing. One of the comments that person made was, "Well, yes, this is being driven by the packer, and they just want bigger cattle." I would argue that we're dragging the packer kicking and screaming. That the cattle feeders are driving this as much as anything because they have done the same math we did and came to the same conclusion that making them heavier and bigger made sense. And as Fred and I were talking just about cattle prices in the cattle market, when I start looking at what feeder cattle are worth today, the only way they make sense is I need to be farther to the right of this chart than to the left. If we're going to be profitable feeding these very valuable cattle coming in the yard, we have to add more weight to them just to make the dollars and cents work out. So that's really the reasons why. That's a fairly short part of this presentation. It comes down to dollars and cents. By the way, on an efficiency standpoint, one of the things that we knew already and got reinforced by our data is that if we measure feed efficiency on a carcass weight basis, they really aren't. It's not as detrimental if we're selling on a carcass weight basis as compared to live weight. But what we do need, what I want to focus on for the rest of this, say half an hour or so, is what can go wrong and how do we get around that. By the way, I told Fred that is a beef on dairy carcass. We were one of the tour stops on the Alta Genetics tour last summer, and we found three different steers of different genetic types to run through our meat lab. And that's a great example of these beef on dairies, when things work well, why they have an absolute fit in our industry. Because if you look at that steak, that rib shot, that's an easy ribeye to sell. It's the right size, it's the right shape, it's got plenty of marbling. That's going to find a home on a lot of white tablecloth kind of beef orders. That's one of the real valuable parts of this type of cattle fitting into the beef sector. So back to that gentleman's email. He absolutely though had a point in terms of retail cuts getting too big and carcasses getting too big. One of the challenges from the packer side is they have to be able to chill carcasses fast enough. And as the laws of physics tell us, we add more mass coming into that cooler at 102 or so degrees. It takes more energy, and it is slower to get that entire carcass size cooled down. The other part is, as we increase carcass size, we increase ribeye and every other muscle. That can be a good thing, but we can certainly get to be too big. We can have carcasses that they're outside the bounds, or retail cuts outside the bounds of what's acceptable, because if we get those too large, and most people want an inch steak that's cut an inch or so thick. If that ribeye is 17 some inches, we might run into trouble where we've priced ourselves out of a lot of people's pocketbooks because of as we start multiplying the price times the more ounces, we might end up getting to where that doesn't fit into the budget. If we cut them thinner, we can meet that price point. However, now we've got this thin steak that might be more difficult to cook correctly, and we run the risk of damaging consumer satisfaction. And that becomes a real issue when, if we look at the math, the rib and the loin primals represent about 40% of the carcass value. So, what about steak size? I think we're going to see some creative cutting approaches that to get around some of this. This photo was shared to me by my coworker, Dr. Zach Smith, and it's got a little age on it. To be honest, he took this in Lubbock, Texas, in 2018. What that is, the fine print's very hard to read, but it's the ribeye caps. They call it a ribeye cap steak. And if you think of the next time you go out to a prime rib and you get where the the cut comes from closer to the chuck side of that rib roll, and it's got those extra muscles around the outside, the ones that really taste really good. That's what those are. So what someone did is they pulled out. This is USDA Prime. They pulled those muscles off of a big ribeye, rolled them up, and charged $20 a pound for them 6 years ago, 8 years ago. I don't know what that might cost today, but that was an example of some creative cutting approaches to add value to that. I had a chance to, my wife and I, with another group, go to a nice white tablecloth restaurant in Nashville this winter, and they had a steak on their menu that essentially, if you look at that picture I'm showing you with the cap steak, there's a corresponding longissimus ribeye muscle out there, and that was on the menu on this steak place as a good quality steak that they could sell at a slightly lower price point. So my point on this is I think some of the steak size issues we'll be able to solve. Sharp. We talk about in the cattle industry that a sorting stick is a very effective tool. In the fab floor, sharp knives are valuable as well as a way to start creating some differentiated products. The other issue that I think is certainly can be a bit of a challenge for the feedlot, especially, is can we manage bigger cattle? Things like cattle handling equipment, transportation. I'm showing you this picture of this squeeze chute we have at our research yard in Beersford, South Dakota. We have a near identical model to that chute, and it's not a brand endorsement, it's just an example. But there's a particular reason why we have that chute now is because on a feeding study where we took cattle out to about a 1650 end weight, we ended up getting a steer stuck in a silencer squeeze chute that wasn't specced out to handle these cattle we were selling today. And I told Dr. Smith, they said, we are never doing this again. We are going to find a chute that's big enough that we don't have to worry about it. And that's what we found. So that's one example. We're going to talk about bruising here in a little bit, but a lot of these trucks aren't made to handle the cattle size we've got right now. From a cattle health standpoint, we're getting the animal larger, but that doesn't necessarily mean that steer's feet and legs are any better than they were. And we create some issues from that standpoint. I get concerned, especially with black-eyed cattle. Notwithstanding the weather we've been having lately, sooner or later we're going to have heat stress here in the upper Midwest, and if it follows the playbook, it usually does. It's going to come on with a vengeance here sometime in the next few weeks, and we're going to have cattle that aren't ready for it. And I worry about some of these very large, heavy, fat, black-hided cattle and how well they deal with some of that first few heat events. And as we get them bigger and fatter, they become more sensitive to that. Finally, also just the late-term deads in the feedlot from a variety of causes. Um, as we've made cattle bigger, we aren't necessarily just because that steer weighs 1,700 pounds, the heart and lungs haven't necessarily grown to match that. That creates some issues for us in terms of as at the end of the feeding period. And from a financial standpoint, when we lose a $4,300 steer at the very end, that is that's a painful cost on that closeout because of all the investment we had, not only to get it bought, but the feed it took to get them there. That becomes a real issue. And I think it's associated with what's going on with as we make cattle bigger. I showed these, and I should have. This was courtesy of one of our graduates from SDSU Animal Science, Dr. Sidney Lammers, who's on faculty at Sam Houston State now. These are some real pictures of some cattle that they saw as part of some beef quality audits. That one particularly on the one on the right where that steer had been, or it might have been a cow, but doesn't matter, heavily bruised carcass. And my point on this is as we get cattle bigger, they become more vulnerable to bruising, especially if trucks are a bit undersized, if if facilities are a little bit not designed for animals of that size, we start creating opportunities for more bruising. The trim loss on that carcass on the right was going to be substantial. And if that carcass were sold on a grid or on a live dress basis, guess what? Guess who gets to pay for that? It was the owner of the animal because all that trimming is going to come before the hot scale. So those are a couple of things that from a standpoint of bruising, and we have not gotten better. This is from the NCBA beef quality audit where they go into multiple packing plants across the U.S. and Canada, or U.S. rather, and measure a lot of different things. But one of the things they measure is bruising. And in 2011, about three-fourths of the carcasses had no bruises at all. That's now only half of those, about only half in 2022 were free of a bruise. And 6% of the carcasses today have three or more. So we're not getting better. If anything, we've gotten worse. So that's becoming more of an economic hit to our industry. Uh, the other part is just physical space. You know, in my experience with barns, those started coming into our area about 20 some years ago. And, the rules of thumb were, well, about 45 square foot on a bed pack and about 25 square foot on a slat floor. And there's a little variation. But we, had those kind of rules and thumb in place for quite a while now. That's when we were shipping cattle out at 1,400 pounds. Now we're considerably bigger. And I think it's an open question if those rules of thumb still apply with these cattle that get bigger and physically just take up more room. And so, do we need to reduce stocking rate? I could make the argument to justify that. The challenge then, though, becomes now we are spreading out all that fixed cost over a smaller number of cattle, and that changes what we need to think about in terms of yardage and cost of gain. So, what's going to change then in the future is how we manage cattle. And I tell folks my crystal ball is not particularly good, and you can take what I tell you and what I suggest with whatever degree of skepticism you feel appropriate. But I do think there are some things we're going to be doing differently in the future, and I think it's also an area where we need to. I'm biased. I have a research appointment, so of course I'm going to say we need to do some more research. But I do think there are some questions that we can ask as we go forward on how we manage cattle. So, if I think of what cattle need today, um, we need cattle. When I put my cattle buyer hat on, I need cattle that can stay healthy. I absolutely need cattle that perform. And today, that looks like cattle I can take the heavy carcass weights that grow fast and do so efficiently, and then capture as many premiums as I can with a manageable discount. But as I think about tomorrow, I'm going to have to think about some of those drawbacks I already talked about, keeping cattle healthy as I'm taking them. How do I manage bullet point one and bullet point three? How do I make sure I can keep cattle healthy and also make them bigger? So I think that's the next area of new frontier, maybe, of how we manage cattle is how do we balance some of these factors we've talked about. Part of that is, not all of this, and this slide probably applies a little more if I'm talking to a purely beef cattle audience, because one of their concerns is when they hear this message, they say, I really don't want to manage 1,700-pound cows in western South Dakota. That doesn't fit my range environment very well. And my message is, well, you don't have to, because in part, we have some technology tools that will help us manage growth on the back end. Things like implants, which are widely accepted and used regardless of genetic type on cattle. Also, the beta agonists. The not to give a I'm not trying to give a commercial to a particular company, but Elanco's Experior product has really become, I would say that's been the big player in this in terms of market acceptance, because not only does it do what the marketing claims are in terms of reducing greenhouse gas and some of those other issues or reasons for the label, it's also very, very effective in terms of adding carcass weight. Those are things from a technology standpoint that cattle feeders can use to accomplish some of those goals. And there's also, some management decisions that I talked about already that, we, as we add cattle, we're extending the length of cattle feeding. We're owning cattle and keeping them on feed for longer. There's also some nutritional strategies. These are some of the things that our group here at SDSU are working on. We've done some work with different types of soy protein to attempt to better match amino acid flow and protein quality to the animal's requirement with the effect of creating more lean growth and greater weight gain. I think, in terms of new ideas or things that we're going to be looking at in the future, I think we're going to be doing some expanded use of forage systems as a way to, quote, frame out cattle, whether that's grazing on, maybe a traditional range type approach or on something like annual forage or residue, or backgrounding systems where we're using, things like harvested hay, silage, maybe some, lower starch byproduct feeds to essentially delay fattening, frame cattle out, allow them to potentially. We know that we can manipulate growth rates to affect final carcass outcomes. But we could probably use more data on how to better utilize these strategies. This area of the cattle feeding business is, from a research standpoint, is a little bit of the redheaded stepchild. There's a lot of work done on starting calves to manage health. There's a lot of work on the back end to, any kind of inputs going into finishing systems. This in between, is a little bit of a black box that we could do a better job of, in my opinion, understanding how to use. Um, I'm going to show a little bit of the. I promised we'd talk a little bit about our beef on dairy data, and I'm going to do that. This work was done by Dr. Becca Francis as part of her PhD program. She's now works for Elanco Animal Health here in the Nebraska Upper Midwest area. But what we did is we wanted to look at feeding more forage for a longer period of time in a receiving diet to these cattle. So these came to us out of southern Iowa, weighing just about 425. Their initial diet was about 60% corn silage. That diet was fed for either 28, 56, or 84 days. The total length of the feeding period was about 283. And so what we're doing is trying to see what happened as we fed more forage longer. What can we do from both a health and a carcass outcome standpoint? One of Becca's, interest was in the area of liver abscesses. I wish I could tell you that we found the silver bullet and that fixed the problem. We didn't, but there was maybe a few little things, but it didn't completely solve that issue. But what we did point out is, to some extent, it worked like we might thought, where longer period of time on a higher energy diet did result in especially if comparing the 28-day to the to some of those longer feeding periods, it changed a little bit on carcass weight. But what I want to point out is, so on those 84-day cattle, uh, they were less efficient, as you'd expect, but they were also leaner. And so one of the things I wanted to look at, we knew from some other data that been conducted at Texas Tech and other places, that if we were to perhaps fed them to a equal fat point, could we have added more pounds? And so what I did is compared the 28 day to the 84. There was roughly 600ths less rib fat when we fed more roughage. Using Mike Gallian's, he's got the best data set. Using that, we would have basically taken another 17 days to get that extra 600ths of fat. That would have equated to roughly 34 pounds of increased carcass weight comparing those two. So if I look at those differences, I'm getting now up to, by the that's a typo. Now this makes sense. The 28-day cattle, I'm sorry, that should be 942, not 842 pounds. I was confusing myself. All right. So we think if we'd have fed those long roughage day cattle an extra 17 days, we might have gotten an extra 34 pounds of carcass weight, comparing, or in this case, 12 pounds. I'm sorry. We would have added what we saw with those cattle that were grown slower. We would have changed them by 34 pounds, which would have made them about 12 pounds heavier than the short roughage cattle. I hope that I'm stumbling around on that a little bit, but I hope that makes sense. We would have taken them from roughly 940 to about 950 by feeding them more roughage. So then what I did is I used the diets we ran, used a yardage charge. I used 75 cents a day. You can argue with me whether I doubt that I am, perhaps I'm too Perhaps I'm a little on the high side, but it's not more. It's not. If anything, It's certainly not 25, 30 cents. We could argue whether it's 50, 60, or 75. I use 75 cents a day. I also included a interest charge because as we delay marketing, unless you're at you're at a point where we're not borrowing money at all, there is a cost to do that. And At the time I created these slides for the dairy beef short course back in March, that added 12-pound difference was worth about $46 a head. I just punched the numbers in today. That's probably closer to $50 a head. But the net result is, in our instance, under the conditions of our experiment, we still couldn't quite make that work. This example shows that adding more forage for longer resulted in about an extra $20 a head difference in net profit. With the improved cattle, with the improvements in terms of cattle value, that's now about $15 a head. But the question I would have is, and our study wasn't well set up to answer this question. We just don't have enough pens, enough numbers. But can we affect health late in the feeding period? And can we change late-term deaths? If I wanted to make up a $19 a head deficit, I need to cut death loss at the end by 0.5%. Um, I'm not claiming we can necessarily do that, but that is the difference we'd have to have, and that difference is not all that great. We're only talking in a 200 head pen, one animal dying or not dying ends up taking care of that negative $19 that we took on by spending more time and more feed. Uh, this was a real interesting, work. This isn't something we normally think of doing with beef dairy crosses, although it is being done in the industry, at least by some entities that are handling these cattle, is what happens if we graze them. And so this was some work done by Dr. Paul Beck at Oklahoma State, where he compared using some beef dairy cross cattle. Some of them were grazed on improved pastures or range. Others went directly to the feedlot. The grazing cattle increased outweight, reduced costs. The net return was roughly the same. One of the things, though, they noted was these genetics, because of the way they've been reared, needed a little time to learn how to graze. That's not something they intuitively knew how to do. So if we are going to do that, there's a little bit of probably opportunities to study things on terms of cattle behavior and how do we help those cattle figure out how to be bovines in grazing systems. Finally, I think from especially with this group of cattle, there's some things on available genetic tools that are going to help us do some of that. I think in terms of targeted sire selection. Thankfully, we've moved past the era of where the sire's being used on dairy cows to produce these beef dairy crosses. We've moved past the era of tell me what you have in the tank that's cheap and black. And that we've started recognizing the value of targeted selections. There are certainly some index tools and other things that are available to improve selection accuracy. If in your system you have any involvement in selecting what sires go in used in this kind of environment, I'd sure encourage you to use some of those different tools because I think there's an opportunity to really create some really valuable cattle by carefully selecting what sires are used on either on dairy cattle, whether that's a Holstein or a Jersey background. From a just a animal husbandry standpoint, I think this is an area we're going to continually to work on. We know that mud or adverse conditions negatively affect bigger cattle more so than light cattle. And just think of the physical exertion required to navigate an open feedlot pen when we have muddy conditions. For this particular audience, a lot of those cattle are going to be managed in barns, which also though creates some challenges. What weight do we going to put cattle in barns? If we're going on slat floors, do we really want to have cattle on those surfaces for 250, 300 days? Maybe there's a need for some other housing systems for a time to help them make that transition. In my opinion, if we're using slat floor barns, we have to use mats. But part of that means there's also needs to be a replacement strategy because I think it's pretty well recognized they don't last forever. And once they start deteriorating, we need to have a strategy in place to say, all right, how often are we going to remove those? If we're dealing with bed pack barns, managing that bed pack, and then also having a plan for fallout cattle, which really relates to feet and legs. What I see is the cattle in most cases, the reasons cattle have to move out of barns is because of feet and leg and mobility issues. And at the values we're at, having some kind of plan for those, I think is critically important. So the take-home message is that that I I hope I've shared information that would support this, is that I don't see the economic signals that have been driving us to increase carcass weights changing anytime soon. Fred and I were talking a little bit before this started just about, moisture conditions across the Midwest and Plain states. And, in a word, they're not good. And they're not good in the areas that have a lot of beef cows. As I talk to ranchers in the Dakotas and other places, I am picking up very few indications that despite the very strong cattle market we have right now, I'm picking up very few indications that beef producers and ranchers are adding heifers right now. Um, Partly it's expensive to do. We may not have the labor to do it well. And right now, in a lot of cases, we just don't have a good enough assurance we have the feed to support it. So what that's going to mean is that there's going to be a need to increase carcass weight because we still have really strong beef demand, but less numbers of cattle that we have to meet that. So in order to meet it, we have to do everything we can to, there's an incentive to do what we can in order to, to increase output. When I give this type of presentation to folks running Angus cows or pick your favorite beef breed, I'm not going to tell them how you need to raise cattle, but I will tell them is that any systems that can produce cattle that have the potential to produce more output are going to be rewarded. Uh, Also, though, and I showed, I think, a great picture of what our objective maybe ought to be from a whether that's that particular picture, that carcass. I don't care if it's a beef dairy cross or an Angus or whatever. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good steak. We cannot go backwards on product quality. We've been down that road, and you only really need to go to your favorite retailer and compare what steak is worth compared to pork loin, and then decide which business do you think offers more opportunity or do we want to be in because they're I think Hy-Vee's running some special, at least in our store, of I think it was three pork chops for $5. I don't know what I'm blessed to have family that keeps me in beef in the freezer, but I don't know what a steak might cost, but it's more than that. And so what's been helping us lifting all these boats has been consumer demand, and we simply cannot go backwards. I think also one of the challenges in this entire system is how do we communicate value and get paid, especially if we're not, if our segment of this is we're going to uh, transfer ownership after the calf ranch, after the hutch, or after the calf ranch, or maybe out of a grow yard. How do we communicate value to that next buyer? And ultimately, we need to make sure we're getting paid for the inputs and the effort we put into that. So with that, that's my contact information. And again, if I know this is recorded, but if you go to our extension website, extension.ststate.edu, you can find all of this information. If you have any other, thoughts, suggestions, opinions, bricks, whatever, I would be happy to visit with people about that. With that, that should, I'm going to stop sharing and open. We'll see whatever people have for questions. And I think, Fred, you're probably going to monitor those, and then we'll, for the remainder of the hour, I guess we'll talk about whatever people have in mind. Fred, you may be muted. I can't hear you, Fred.
Can you hear me now?
You bet.
All right, very good. Guess it helps to have all the buttons pushed just right. Thank you, Warren. We appreciate the information you shared. We've got a fairly small group here. If you have a question, go ahead and unmute your mic and just let us know what you're thinking. I'll give a second or two to see if we have any comments. Melissa, you've
Warren,
always,
this is Chanda Engel.
Yes.
I was wondering or have been thinking a lot, like as we see, you mentioned we're kind of droughty in a lot of the cow calf areas. And so, given how we've learned how to manage lighter weight calves going into a feed yard, do you think that we'll see more early weaning and maybe extreme early weaning to keep cows, but to get calves to take some pressure off the drought areas?
Yes. That's easy. Yeah, we're going to see it. I just saw something on Facebook and Sale Barn in Platte, South Dakota. I think they sold 1,000 baby calves this week.
Yes,
Um,
I just saw that this morning too.
and
That was
it's
crazy.
and you know, perhaps I don't know. I know a few of the people on here. I don't know everyone, but from a cow herd management standpoint, when we can shut milk production off, her feed requirements drop a lot, and so that's going to be a strategy that's going to get used already starting, uh, because one of I think the difficulties of dealing with for the beef cow native beef producers is going to be how do I keep my arms around inventory in a situation where I don't have the traditional grass is not where it needs to be, because the financial implications of you know, the weigh up cow, she is worth a lot of money, but her replacement is really a lot of money. And we give up income and now we have to try to reinvest, and we're not dealing with swapping $1,000 cow for a 1,500 anymore. We're swapping a 2,500 plus for a 5 or 6 thousand. And so I expect we're going to see early weaning, with either retaining ownership of those calves or dry lot systems. As I said on one of those slides, my crystal ball is not great, but I have a hard time imagining that isn't going to be part of our playbook, at least in the Dakotas, Western Nebraska, and other areas.
You bring up a good point about dry lotting. I was kind of curious too if you've seen anything or heard of anybody looking at maybe shifting their feedlot capacity space to dry lot cow production.
Um, I saw an ad again on Facebook. Someone was advertising that they had pen space available, and I had it was a conversation, I think, well, yesterday, with an individual who works in the nutrition business who is working with a client that they're looking at breeding cows in a dry lot, and thinking about when do we you know, how quick, if it rains, how quickly could they send cows to grass after breeding? And it almost sounds like that, the book answer, Chanda, from working with Dr. Perry would be, oh, maybe we wait 42 days. That might become a moot point because they may be forced into waiting that long anyway just to get enough grass production to justify sending cattle out. Because what this individual said is the grass just isn't doing much right now.
Thank you, Warren.
You're welcome.
Any other questions coming from the group? Got a couple questions that have come in. Is there a maximum size considering frame and structure, especially lameness? Is there an upper point, or is it the point at the processor?
Well, I can tell you one example of a hard limit, and this was something Dr. Zach Smith shared with me at a meeting he was at in Minnesota, that someone was relaying this story, and I'm not quite sure what plant or where this was, but they delivered some cattle, and some of the cattle weighed 2,500 pounds, and the plant could not get them to the knock box where they would be euthanized. And so they backed them up. They were euthanized in the holding pen, and the cattle feeder got zero. So at some point, the heavyweight discount becomes 100% when you can't get them to the box. Now, to me, that was an example of, you know, a sorting stick would have told us at some point, these cattle are awfully big. Let's, even if we don't have a load, let's get them to Sioux Falls, Yankton, Mitchell, Watertown, Pipestone, some place that sells fat cattle and turn them into cash. But yeah, as I talk to cattle feeders, that's the part they bring up is keeping them sound enough is the issue. Um, Also the fat composition. There's gonna, we are getting these cattle really fat. And right now, Packer can't do a whole lot about it because the feeder has the leverage and they need pounds in the plant. If that changes, if a plant, if we have another plant closes or goes on strike or whatever else, we could see that discounts on fat composition happen quickly. So, I have our team has a research proposal in with the Iowa Beef Council. We'll see if, cross our fingers, see if they get funded. But one of our thoughts is that we can maybe keep cattle on roughage for a much longer period of time. And I'm thinking around 1,200 pounds before they go on a finishing diet. I don't know if that completely helps our feet and leg issues. Might help from a founder standpoint. Um, Probably we think helps from a composition standpoint, but also we're also not advocating that cattle need to be 23, 2,400 pounds on average going to slaughter either. That clearly is getting up there uh, to where it's an issue. Honestly, the market might be helping us out a little bit because at the prices we're seeing now, we're starting to get people incentivized to say, let's get wheels under cattle sooner before this market drops. As I'm hearing of 260 bids in the north getting passed. That's now we're starting to get to some dollars to say 1,500 pounds is big enough, and we have hot summer coming on. There's some incentive to start moving cattle along, perhaps a little earlier. But that's the other unintended consequence of that is there's going to be that creates more of a supply issue later on. So, Fred, you ask a great question. I think we're still fumbling around a little bit on where that upper limit is, but I am convinced there is one. I think it's going to be on the soundness and the health aspect more so than the Packer side.
With our dairy cow numbers, I mean, we're seeing some incredible prices for cull cows. So they're real lean. We all know that. We've got a lot of fat coming in on these heavy weights. Is that bolstering up some fat prices? Are we going to see the fat prices continue to struggle?
Uh, you mean the fat price for fat cattle?
Well, the price for the what they trim off.
Uh, Maybe, although I think they're taking that as the cost of doing business because we need to have we need the sellable meat, and if and we need pounds because we don't have numbers, and they're living with the trim loss.
Okay.
Um, the rumblings I hear is that as soon as they have the opportunity to put that leverage back on us as cattle feeders, they're going to do so. Uh, but right now they don't have that. I bring up a great point. I think that's and I'm not certainly not a market expert, but that would be that demand for ground beef is what's going to be supportive of the way up cow market. Because we don't have enough of the lean trims to balance out the 50-50 lean we produce from the slaughter side. And so and I think that's also, as you look at, some of these carcass values, you see choice and select at near par and sometimes even inverted. I think what I think that is the fact that we just simply need more lean trim and a select grading carcass isn't as much of a has some value, maybe not as a steak cut, but we can certainly use the lean trim off of that steer, so or heifer. So I think you know we got this beef is kind of an odd market. We've got the high end white tablecloth, ribeye, sirloin, strip steaks, and then we have ground beef, and they're both very very important, and they're very different and from a how we make those. So it's a kind of a fascinating interplay of the two as to how we fit consumer demand.
Do we have another question coming in from the audience?
Yeah, hi Warren, this is Melissa. I got a question for you. Um, I know that you don't have a crystal ball, but I would like to know what your thoughts are as far as the genetics that are being used on the beef side. Do you see any differing trends? I mean, just kind of based on number of units of semen sold, it kind of seems like the Akushi and the Wagyu being used in the dairy has kind of that trend is kind of sunsetting a little bit. Do you think people are going to stay the course? Is Angus going to be the golden standard that everybody keeps going with, or what are your thoughts? And then also a second question to that, how are like our purebred beef embryos as the cost of those are getting more economical? How is that going to play into the genetic makeup of these calves are looking like?
Sure. So I, I'll answer the easy one first. Yeah, I think the Akushi Wagyu, that's a bit of a niche market, and you know I know some people that are doing well doing that, and then I've also talked to people that feed high Wagyu influenced cattle, and they're not crazy about the ones coming out of dairy cows. And so I don't I think the lion's share of beef semen that is going to go into dairy herds is probably going to be very reflective of what the U.S. beef herd looks like, and they're going to be likely dominated by Angus, if for no other reason, because they're the most widely available. I did just see a little bit of information from someone on LinkedIn promoting using Charolais on those, which and I'm certainly very familiar with with like the Riverview system and what they've done with limousine sires. I think there's a lot of different sire types at work. Um, I question on on some perhaps on some semen. I hear a little bit, and I don't work in this area that closely, but I hear a little that some of the Angus semen that goes into Holstein cows, they were perhaps not necessarily selecting for less mature size from a height standpoint. To me, that makes a lot of sense to do that. I can't imagine we need to add more height to a Holstein cow to make a finished steer. But if we're not careful, we certainly could with certain beef genetics. Um, the second part of that question, I'm not sure what that. Whoa, beef embryos.
Beef embryos, yep.
Um, I some of the feedback I hear, especially going into Jersey cows, I think that might become more important. Um, what there's been Texas Tech has done a little bit of research on those. I think one of the challenges is we how do we manage in the calf ranch? How do we manage that beef? Now it's now a pure beef animal. I think we have to manage that differently than maybe what the conventional wisdom has said. We manage a 100% dairy animal, but I don't know if that research is completely done. Um, and I'm going to raise my hand and say, not it. We're not, our team is not going to start putting in a whole lot of hutches to manage a calf ranch, but gosh, someone sure needs to, because to me, especially if we start putting higher value embryos in now, calf health, early calf life management, do they need more? My Brad Hines has done, I've seen a little of his data that I buy to say we can do more nutritional support on that class of livestock, more so than maybe what we've done would be traditionally used in developing a a dairy replacement heifer. And biologically, it makes sense to me because we're asking an animal to that has a greater potential to put on muscle protein. It makes some sense to me that that animal requires a different nutritional requirement than the Holstein heifer that is not going to get asked to put on quite as much muscle as this either pure beef or 50/50 beef genetics. So I'm not sure, Melissa, I'm answering your question well.
But you
And
are.
I'll,
I wanted to get your opinion. I was just kind of curious, like your thoughts and just different research that's going on. And yeah, I would really appreciate you sharing that.
Very good. David asks, any thoughts on utilizing the myostatin gene in genetic selection?
mm, uh, I don't have a lot of thoughts on that other than I think if there's a place where it could make some sense, it would certainly be, in this, within this genetic type. Um, I also think, because I think of that, that's the Piedmontese, correct? I know just enough to be dangerous about this. Um, yeah,
David, if you want to unmute and kind of share where you're heading this question to, this might be a good chance to do that. I don't know if he can do that or not, but I believe you're right, is where I'm going.
and and I'm familiar with a few of the people in South Dakota that are working with those genetics, and they certainly have a market. The challenge might be, our the marketing systems are right now driven by marbling. If we're using genetics that don't have that potential, we need to now make sure we're in a market channel that rewards what we have. And so I think there's certainly potential to do that. The challenge might be, is they're going to be a fit for some markets and a terrible fit for others. That's my opinion. I certainly could be wrong, but I do think, if we think of, cattle with that gene, and changing muscle shape, to me, that's especially, that's the thing we have to do, or I certainly want to do with the Holstein, is change your muscle shape. So to me, that makes a lot of sense.
Any other questions? I've got one, and it came in a couple weeks after the dairy beef short course in reference to late-term dads. Uh, the comment was they can eat you alive. Is there an insurance product out there to protect investment on this particular risk?
To my knowledge, I don't think so, but I'm gonna hedge that to say, there certainly could be something I just don't know about. Um, I don't think so.
That was the answer that I gave him to.
I know, and I'm thinking of, there's some of like the LRP or livestock gross margin, but I don't think they get into mortality. I'm not an expert, so I know the LRP, that's a price driven. Livestock
Right.
gross margin is a little different, but I don't think it gets into mortality as well. But yeah, that is, that's one of the challenges with, right now is, how do we manage the late term deaths?
Yep. Well,
Warren,
Maybe,
I was
yeah,
gonna maybe make a comment on that, just not not necessarily an insurance policy, but it's really management early life. So making sure that we're protecting those lungs, keeping them healthy, doing that, because that's really a lot of what's causing some of the problems in late term deaths, really, is it's just they don't have any capacity anymore to handle their body because they have scarring from early life. So early life, getting colostrum in, some of those things are super, super important to making sure that they're healthy to the end.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Chanda. And managing, lung health early. So, I think of, with this particular group of cattle in particular that are being, managing calf ranches that may be in barns, getting the ventilation right, to preserve lung health, digestive health. I mean, to be honest, that's one of the reasons I'm interested in this. More extended, moderate energy diet is I think part of perhaps our issues on late term deads, if it's related to digestive health and acidosis, some acidosis can look like respiratory because that animal breathes harder to try to drive off that extra hydrogen. If we, that we may not win the feed efficiency standpoint, but if I can do some things on the other side to to change either digestive bloats, digestive deads, or late term deads, I think I can win if I do that. We're in this from a nutritionist standpoint. We're in a little bit of a weird world because the driver right now is not feed efficiency; it's output because our feed are relative to what cattle are worth, feed is relatively cheap. And so our incentive is to keep cattle alive and then get as many pounds on them as we can without running into some of the roadblocks we talked about. And so, yeah, Chand, I think you're right. I think this starts very early. And, you know, and I also think from a management standpoint, also need to be ready to have a quick hook that if we have something where something's not quite right, they need to go because if they're having some challenges at 1250, 1300, it is not going to get better. I've yet to see feet and legs get better as we make them bigger, unless I can do, unless I have a very the the 5-star comfort hotel to go with them with lots of room, very dry conditions. There's probably some possibilities, but we need to definitely get them a hook, have the hook to get them out of that maybe more intensively managed system, and either turn them into cash or plus put them in a system that imposes less stress. Great points, Chanda. Thank you.
Very good. David commented that he finished some F1 mile Stantons, graded choice number 2 with great eating experience, dressed average at 62%. So there's some potential out there, obviously.
And that might be, as I'm thinking of that, that might be, we know that the dairy genetics have a propensity to marble, and that might actually be, maybe a sweet spot to use those two in combination. There was a number of years ago, we were off topic slightly, but we were approached by a European genetic company to test things like Belgian Blue, Blonde Aquitaine, Full French Charlet, French Limousine, some of those French genetics, and unfortunately, to do that well requires lots and lots of cattle to really evaluate bulls. And when we threw out, my former now dean said you're probably looking at somewhere around $1 million to do that study well. We never heard from him again. But I think though that David, to your point, that combination of the Piedmontese, and I've known some of the people that are producing some of those, and their feedback from their customers are rave reviews. And perhaps that combination of dairy genetics plus that might get us where we do get the choice grade, but now we've got some of the tenderness attributes that the Piedmontese type genetics would bring to us.
Very,
I would expect certainly get away from any of those eye shape issues that sometimes we see on even on some of the Angus Holstein crosses.
very good. Well, we're past 1 o'clock. Thank you, Warren, for sharing this information and your
You're welcome.
insights on carcass size and beef industry. This program has been recorded and will be available on the I-29 Moo University website. Uh, Allow me 3 to 5 working days to get it up there. In addition, I will email everybody who registered when it is available, as well as including the link to the program evaluation. Thank you for your participation, and I look toward seeing you at the next Beef on Dairy Dialogue next month. That concludes this program. Thank you, Warren.
Thank you.